All right, welcome to Satsang this fine day. Um, I was today I selected for us to wrestle with a little bit some of the later there's three books that Gene Dunn wrote, which basically were I Am That books. They cover the later period in Nisargadatta's life. So his Satsang shifted a little bit, and so I thought it'd be fun just to play with one of those. And then, as you saw, I got a little piece on personalization and what, it dawned on me. It just seems like, everyone who does this kind of thing has an interest, something that grabs them once they start to speak. And, for Maharaj, it was always go sit on the I am. For Ramesh, it was always like, how does this work in daily life? He was always very, like concerned about that. And you can tell probably from where I come from that my big concern is, how does it feel when it's all in process? That was the for whatever reason I have always felt like a lot of what I hear is really really nice, but it doesn't necessarily contain a sense of things a lot of times. It's a conceptual delivery. So when you see me doing some of these pieces I'm doing, what I'm trying to do is usually is take what it is that I'm seeing or feeling and not in Nisargadatta or Ramesh or whoever, and I'm trying to give it a sense, if you will, a sense of what does it feel like on the ground. Um, there's actually there's a story which I use all the time. You've probably heard me tell it before, but a man's going down the street and he falls into a sinkhole in the middle of a big city, and he looks up from the sinkhole. He can just see barely onto the sidewalk, and so he starts to call out for help. And as it happens, a priest is walking by. So the priest stops, listens to his cries, and says, "I got you covered." Pulls a piece of paper out, writes a prayer on the piece of paper, and throws it down in the hole, and continues on his way. Well, the man, of course, looks at this thing, wads it up, throws it in the corner, and continues, I need help, I need help. And as luck would have it, a doctor walks by. Of course, the doctor, similar reaction, listens to the pleas for help, pulls out a piece of paper, writes a prescription down on the piece of paper, and throws it down in the hole. Well, he got really lucky because a little minute later walks a friend who comes by, and his friend recognizes the voice and says, "Oh my God." And so he jumps down into the hole. And his friend who's in the hole says, "Geez, Joe," he said, "I really appreciate it." He said, "But now we're both down in the hole." And Joe looks at him and he says, "Yeah, I know." He says, "But I've been in this hole before and I know how to get out." And that story has always really touched me because that's the in life, that's the sense that um, I've always felt that seeking needs to contain somehow. How do you do this? We live on a set of assumptions, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And those assumptions we go to in an automatic way to define how our life is. And so we're down in the hole with no way out. And not only that, none of our assumptions cover how to get out of the hole. Right? So those need to be in essence seen through. And in the seeing through of those, how is it that one climbs out of the hole? So that's what you'll see, and that's why these pieces that I've been writing have, at least I'm hoping that more sense of tangibility, if you will. So if you pulled the piece down, you may or may not have done. This is a Nisargadatta. It's prior to consciousness. And the nice thing about it is that they date it. So this is April of 1980. Now remember that Nisargadatta passed in 81. I don't remember the exact date. It was later in the year, if I'm not mistaken, July or August. And so this would have been a satsang that Ramesh was at. This is the time that he was there with Nisargadatta. And you may see a little bit of a difference. Now, the thing that's different here is we don't get really long long pieces. These are just pieces extracted, kind of the piece, the big piece of the satsang, as it were. So the questioner, he says, is the world as we see it a thought? It is written in some places that when one sees the world, one does not see the self. And conversely, when one sees the self, one does not see manifestation. So now that question by itself confuses me a little bit because um, you are the self, and so the self does the seeing, as it were. So to see the self, I'm not sure from what vantage point, but he does go on. He kind of just gives his own answer. Maharaj does. He said, the world is nothing but a picture of your own eye consciousness. He says, as if you had received a phone call telling you that you are, and immediately the world appears. Right? Phone call rang, picked it up, you are, bang, there's your world. Now you may notice that when you wake up in the morning, it's a little like that. The phone call rang, you open your eyes, there's the world. Anybody who's opened their eyes and the world wasn't there, let me know. I have yet to have anybody answer that question with a positive. He says, now when you're in deep sleep and you feel you are awake, the dream world appears simultaneously. Same activity, right? You get the other piece with it. He says, with the I am, the world appears in waking and dream states. Questioner comes back and he says, can one see the world without the presence of ego? Right? Great question, actually. He says, when is there an ego? He said, the ego is there when you have certain reactions. You take deliver of what is observed spontaneously. You cling to it, register it, and only then is there an ego, right? So this is an as if you will, right? When I talked about the assumptions of being in the bottom of the hole, right, you're living as if certain things are true. The ego is basically a living as if certain things were true. And so that's what the behavior basically follows. Now, consciousness is really an interesting thing. It seems to cater to that. So if one wants to believe that they're in charge, consciousness seems to cater to that particular wanting to be in charge. Those particular body minds look for all the world to be in charge. He says, you see some building material lying on the road. You think you are a carpenter and you start figuring out how to use the material. The thought process is started, the ego starts. If you are a nobody, you will not bother about the building material. You just observe it and go on your way. Once it is out of sight, it is out of mind. But when you receive that delivery, you cogitate over it, and the ego has started. Right? So, questioner, so when it comes to the utility of what is seen, that's when the ego comes into being. Yes. So think about that, the utility. So you hear all the questions in the satsangs, people will say, what is the use of that? What's the payoff? Whenever you hear those kinds of questions, right? Those are questions for the ego. And we're so accustomed to being the ego that that's the frame from which we ask questions. So when you see somebody who's been seeking for 50 years, right, you can understand how that happens. Because if you ask ego questions for 50 years, then what you're going to get likely are ego answers. And that loop is going to continually, be in process, around and around and around again. Right? So recognize that. Recognize when it's happening to you. I'm exhausting myself with the same kind of questions. That's a pretty good indication that the question itself may need a framing, a reframing, right? So Nisargadatta says, yes, that's the nature. He says, to get back to my other question, when the world is seen, the self is not. When the self is seen, the world is not. Is that so? Maharaj said, it is the other way. When you know that you are, the world is. If you are not, the world is not. So what he's talking about here is the autonomous individual, right? If you know who you are, the autonomous individual, then the world is. right? When there is no autonomous individual, yes, the arising of the world manifestation continues to happen, but it is not. It is seen as that's when it's called illusionary, right? That's the difference that he's making there. He says, is the I the self? I'm talking about the difference between the I am and the thought, I am a man, which is the ego. In the I am consciousness, does the world exist? Can you see it? Maharaj, when you wake up, you have only the sense of being. Without words, this is the primary principle, the prerequisite. Later on, you know fully that you are and the world is, but that is an illusion, like the horns of a hare. That must be a saying. I've never heard it before, like the horns of a hare, Hare. The world is like a dream world, finally. Understand this point very thoroughly. You're dealing too much with the ego. Have you understood what was said about the ego? He says, I think I have. If I ask another question, maybe I can resolve it. Using the analogy of the snake and the rope, right? Seeing the rope in a dimly lit place and mistaking it for a snake. If we use the world in that analogy, where is the mistaken identity here? He says the self is the world. You were talking about removing the identity between the self and the world, aren't you? First of all, dispose of the self, understand what the self is, get to know the self first, and then get to know what the world is. The reason the world appeared is that you came to know that you are. So the minute that you recognize yourself as a separate piece, then the world emerges with it. And you have the duality. He says, how can one in the waking state, this is a great question. He says, how can one in the waking state lose the sensation of the world altogether and just be the self? Maharaj, well, you'll have to consult the sun. Ask him, do you get rid of your light? Light is manifestation of the sun. Can you separate the light from the sun, or the sun from the light? Because of the sun, the light is. Because of you, your world is. Because the witnessing state happens, hence you are. Because you are, witnessing is palpably felt. Because the sun is, light is. If there is no witnessing, where is the witness? Dwell there. The being is the witness, question mark. And here he finishes his little sentence. He says, there are two witnessing stages. Beingness witnesses all this manifestation. Beingness, remember, the sense of being. Witnessing of this beingness, consciousness, or absolute awareness, happens to the eternal principle, the absolute. Right? So the first stop is be with the I am, right? And over time, or in the case of some folks, no time, it moves to the absolute awareness. Okay, so you see that. All right, now that was April 8th. So we're going to jump down to April 30th now. And there's actually one little piece in April 30th that I want to just dwell on for a second, because it's going to have to do with a lot of what we're going to hear in a minute. And that is our way of personalizing. In other words, injecting personalization into our entire world. So here you go. Maharaj, the consciousness that I am has created and sustains all the wonders in the world for which men take credit. And here's the piece I want to hear. On the other hand, this consciousness has no control over itself. Right? So when you think about consciousness, one of the ways to do that, because we have a habit of attempting to give consciousness a will, because we have a will, so we want that personalization. We want that consciousness personalized, right? Consciousness personalized is what we all commonly call God, right? And when we refer to God, we say he or she does this, he or she thinks that, he or she wants this to happen. So happening by itself, when you make the comment that consciousness happens by itself, This is what you're saying. Consciousness has no control over itself. There's not a controlling principle of personalization or will, which is what we apply to our world to result in the ego. It's that injection of personalization. So he goes on and he says the principle out of which you have sprouted has tremendous powers. Lord Krishna has said, you worship me, be devoted to me. That means what? The knowledge I am, which is indwelling in you, worship that only, right? You charge your beingness with these tremendous qualities of Lord Krishna. Your beingness means Lord Krishna, be devoted to that. Now, he uses Lord Krishna because that's one of the entities that he's very familiar with. In the initial stages, your devotion is of a surrendering type. So what's it take to surrender? All right. Surrender is an activity of an entity, typically, right? Surrendering. He says you worship some principle and surrender to that principle. In the final stages, you become the entire universe. What has to fall off for that entire universe to be the entire universe? The sense of personalization that keeps it limited. In other words, that which did the surrendering, right, drops. That surrendering, that very sense that one can surrender drops away. And what emerges is the entire universe. And that's where a lot of people get stuck in their movement is in that not recognizing that simply being surrendered, stay in the surrender, and the surrendering itself will take care of that over time. Right? You move from God to consciousness. God has a will, consciousness doesn't. It's that same piece of movement. Right? He says, your faith towards some principle will not remain the same. It will be continually changing. He says, all of you are like beggars. You have a begging bowl and you want to collect God in that. Take it that this I amness of yours is the unadulterated form of godlyhood. The pure Ishwara state is your beingness. It is quite proper and praiseworthy that you are listening to talks. Nevertheless, you are not getting rid of this attachment to the body-mind. You're constantly surrounded by relations or intimacies connected with your body-mind. So think about it. You spent a lifetime taking delivery, like the construction guy who saw the pile of materials. What can I do with that? We have a lifetime, every moment of doing that. We have a languaging that imprints that that's what we're doing on each other, as though we're participating in life and we're actually utilizing it. So that ego imprinting is always in motion. So it's got a very strong power. He says it is very simple, yet at the same time very profound. The consciousness is the seed of godliness. If we give it its true importance and pray to it, it will flower into godliness. If we don't give it any importance, it will not flower into godliness. Right? At some point in time, the personal becomes not important. That's what he's talking about. You move it into godliness, God is still part of that whole world that arises, right? With will and all of the things that we extend to our ego. Okay, so that's that piece. Any comments at this point? Comments or questions? Okay, cool. Cool. All right. Let's see if Brad gets in today. I hope he does.
But
Go ahead, Joseph.
so I mean, basically, we live most of our life in that place of some kind of connection to personal. That last, what he calls, I don't know if he calls it a last step, but that movement is not, is a very uncommon movement.
It is. It is. No doubt about it. And in some ways it's like swimming upstream,
Mm.
right? So you're going to hear when I talk in a minute about how presence projects itself outward, but it also projects itself the other way. Recognize that the other way is not the common direction that we're all accustomed to, which I think is what you're saying.
Right. So, but so even in the wanting to take the final step, that's again, you're still locked into the wanting.
Right, no doubt about it. No doubt about it. And so the thing you have to see is that the personal, right? That it has two steps, right? It's like charging a battery, right? So that's the I am. The I am is a charged battery,
Mhm.
right? Then when you connect that charged battery with something, it starts operating all the particulars, right? And so what Ramesh is, I mean, what Nisargadatta is trying to say is come back and concentrate on the battery itself, not on the particulars that you've given meaning to, as it were. But but recognize what I think what he's also trying to point out is that in the living of it, right, with all of the conditioning that we have an entire habitual inventory of accounting for all of the particulars. And that habitual inventory plus the conditioning that makes it so is going to continue to happen as one is located on the battery itself. Right. So that's exactly what he's trying to point out. And so it's this two-step process. You start at the personal because when you're speaking to someone who lives in the personal, because that's we all came from that very raw personal only place, right? I mean, we were all climbing mountains and planting our flags for a lot of years, before someone told us there was no mountain, no flag, and no one to climb the hill. And that would have made zero sense to you or me, right? Like if somebody had walked up to me when I was 19 years old, and I'm a missionary in Peru, and they said, "Do you realize there is no you?" I don't know if there's nowhere, like, where do you put that one,
Mhm.
right? So I always chuckle because you see out on the like Facebook is wonderful because the non-duality groups, people are always making statements like that, right? And you're kind of like, okay, nice of you to write us. Not, don't you realize that there is no you? And it's like, not the problem likely that whoever's asking the question is wrestling with, but okay, we'll leave that as an answer. But that tends to be the answer back. And what all Nisargadatta is pointing out is that the sense of personal is is actually breathed from the sense of the impersonal, right? Consciousness is not even in control of itself. That element's not in there. But once the I am is extended, that personalization piece arises and becomes a prominent part of our assumption in terms of how things are.
Yeah,
So
that's a wild idea that consciousness is not in control of itself.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
great.
And all he's trying to say is that, you know, if I had this scientist explain it to me, and you know what really worked, it really worked for me. He's saying, look, take the Big Bang, and he says, just assume that at the Big Bang, at that particular point in time, that particular explosion and propulsion set everything into motion. Now I compare that to the Upanishad where it says that the spider spins its web and draws it back again. So the minute the spider spins its web, Big Bang, right? He says, at that point in time, all of the resulting action was determined, completely determined in that very moment. So if one is living in any point in time during that, which we would assume that that's here and now, right? That's all happening by itself. There isn't any need for that particular activity to have a will, right? It's happened. That for me really helped. That was a great pointer, and I was able to kind of go, okay, I'll hold on to that. I will tell you this, Joseph. I did so begrudgingly. It wasn't like I was like, oh yeah, that's but it did help understand that particular piece.
Mhm.
So, and we're going to go into the more of this. So,
Good.
so here's personalization. Nisargadatta Maharaj's guru gave him a single instruction: abide in the I am. On the surface, this appears simple. What is being pointed to here is not a practice in the conventional sense. It is a redirection from identified immediacy, which is lived as a story, to immediacy in its unbounded form. So remember, when we talk about the impersonal, a lot of times, I don't know about you, but they talk about the personal and the impersonal. When I think of the impersonal, that takes all of that immediacy out of it. But that's not true, right? The immediacy is in the impersonal. It's just not applied and dedicated to separate entities, right? That's where the immediacy comes. He says, why is this so important? Because immediacy, which we call presence, is the root condition of all experience. It is the base from which two very different movements can arise. I talked about this earlier. One movement extends outward, right? One extends outward, the other returns, right? And as Joseph pointed out, that other is a lesser used direction. There's no doubt about that. He says, immediacy, when examined, does not remain unbounded. It extends. And in that extension, it becomes identified. This identification is not an event. It's not a decision. It is a movement accompanied by conditioning, layer upon layer of naming, defining, and structuring. This is what we earlier called entification. The fluid becomes fixed, the undefined becomes defined, the unbounded becomes localized, and among all of these apparent entities, one stands out, I. This is the birth of personalization, not as an entity that exists, but as a movement that claims existence. Not due to its being perceived, but due to its infusion with presence itself. Right? So remember earlier when he asked that first question, I go, it's a little confusing seeing the self when someone says seeing the self, because the self is, right? So that's presence, right? It's when the objects of perception are infused with presence, right? That's the extension outward. And that's when bondage is felt. All right. All right. Presence is breathed into into the entity, first the I, and then all objects within the story of I. Right. So the phone call comes in, and what happens? The all of the objects get then infused with that sense of presence. It has its own propulsion. Right? So there's nobody controlling this sense of personalization. It happens by itself, which becomes automatically magnetized to the particulars arising within the I. Right? That's its natural movement. The instruction to abide in the I am reverses this direction. It does not attempt to fix the person. It does not refine the story. It does not improve the identity. It dissolves the entire framework, because the I am prior to qualification is immediacy without narrative. Know this, know that, know me, just a sense of being presence. Right? This is the beginning of what appears to be a journey, but is in fact a dissolution of the one who journeys. So notice how we do that, right? I am a spiritual seeker. All one has done when they claim they're a spiritual seeker, right, is taken on a new cloak of story. Right? Osho used to make that comment about, be careful of the religious types. They claim they're humble. And what he was saying that, humility is not an attribute. When one sees what one is in the human form, humility is obvious. Right? Okay. So this is where things become subtle, because we are pointed back towards unbounded immediacy. The original movement towards identification has not disappeared. So recognize, right? We have this compartmentalization that we do. I'm moving back. I'm in the I am. I'm moving back that way. The other part is still happening. Those are two pieces happening simultaneously. It remains, not as a visible force, but as a magnetic propulsion. It pulls quietly, relentlessly back towards definition, back towards ownership, back towards personalization. Right.
Can I ask a
So,
question?
yeah.
Okay, I hope the timing is okay. I often have felt that in these descriptions that the motion outward uh, from the source, if you want to call it that, um, starts off and brings all these things into apparent manifestation, and is sort of an outward thing. And then it seems, and correct me if I'm not quite right here, buddy, um, it seems as though as that manifestation type energy continues to be broadcast, so to speak, that the personalization is a natural part of that in some way. And then is that anywhere near being correct?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
because I kind of feel that sometimes, and I haven't known what to do that until you just now had this
Yeah.
conversation, my friend. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. Because here's what it is that whenever you see yourself as being stuck, you're not stuck, right? All that's happened is that likely the two pieces, right, are exerting some equivalent force, and all it's all you are is in one place, so to speak, right? So
Yeah.
so this mind thing about I'm making progress comes into collision with the fact that there's a sense that there's no movement, but there is. Consciousness is moving here, right? In fact, if you are stuck, one should be get pretty excited about that because you spent a lifetime going the other way. Now it's stopped, right? So that's significant, right? So
Wow.
being stuck in the movement it's not being stuck. It's just a really great thing. Things are happening when you quote unquote feel like you're stuck. That's an awesome place to be. Like hang with that because yeah, consciousness is in there doing its dance, right?
Yeah. Thanks.
So he says the birth of a spiritual ego without calling it that. We begin to recognize immediacy. We feel its openness, its absence of boundary. This is immediacy without definition, right? It's silence. And we say, yes, I've got it, right? So it's a little like when you hear a pointer, right? When you hear a pointer like I say, you see people hear pointers and you say, I've got it, right? At a certain point, there's no I, no got, and no it, right? Those are all going to disappear. The statement is a reappearance of personalization, not loudly, not obviously, but as a subtle claiming, I understand, I am present, I am awareness. Immediacy has been re-entified, right? So that's happening, right? A pointer takes, boom, 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 okay? And the and and the and the and the and then and the sense or the knowing that that's what's going on is incredibly helpful. At this point, Maharaj does not refine your understanding, he removes it. He says, whatever you have understood, you are not. Pause there. If something is held as an understanding, it has already become an object. And if it is an object, it is not you. Right?
It feels like silence is a big at the core of all this too, you know. And I've noticed, for whatever this is worth, that if I find myself getting caught up in externals, sometimes I can refer to silence.
Mm-hmm.
And in referring to silence, um, the agitation starts to wane.
So, and just to add on to that, you remember Ramesh's comment, but you guys keep asking questions, right? Well, I always
Yeah.
tell that story because, right, notice that a lot of times, you get to silence, and then what happens is, I've got a question, right? Go back to the question is one birth above the silence,
Yeah.
back to silence,
Yeah.
right? If if
Yeah.
if that's if it can be seen, right? Oh, I have a question.
That, thank you, man. That means
Yeah,
a lot to me.
yeah. Back to silence. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the progeny of personalization, he says, this movement shows up everywhere, not just in gross identification, but in the most refined spiritual language. It's slippery, unnoticed, and invasive. We begin onboarding pointers back to the pristine, unadorned, and undefined immediacy, and we say, yep, I've got it. Automatic infusing begins, right? The unaccounted for propulsion in the opposite direction begins its impact. It begins to convert our very holding of what immediacy is into a specific version, an entity animated with presence, a story. This is the underwater movement of personalization. Let's look carefully at common instances where it appears, right? We speak of effort, even in spiritual context, but what is implied? That there is an entity exerting force, that there is a me doing something. Even when the pointer is clear, effort is an arising within consciousness, not owned, not produced, not directed. Yet, the framing persists. It lies there like a snake in the grass, striking at our absorption of pointers, usually unnoticed. I am making effort. Right? Personalization is quietly returned, you see. It's not simply the return of naming it as such, but the felt experience, which is the tangible presence of presence. It has been named and identified, but don't stop there and be fooled. It has also been animated and personalized. You see it and you feel it. It's in there in that way. Right? We hear everything happens by itself. Nothing personal, right? God's will. And then we say it's God's will. What has happened? The impersonal has been repersonalized. God is an entity understood in a personal way, is the prime mover of manifestation, and lives with us fully charged in personalization. God is simply a cosmic individual, a doer, a chooser, a decision maker. The pointer has been converted back into story. We all know that the use of the term will as a namer carries it with it the sense of the tangible. The same sense we breathe into every story. But that breathing knows it automatically has to occupy an individual entity or story, so it does. Right? When the presence is moving outward, as Joseph and I were talking about, it names and occupies. That's what it does. Evolution. We speak of evolution, progress, advancement, but advancement for whom? Toward what? Even when universalized, the evolution of mankind. Oh, that ought to fool them. The structure remains. Something is becoming better. Something is moving forward. A subtle entity persists. And it is the moving and process that we have labeled evolution. It's alive. Personalization has simply been expanded. So watch when you do that, when what you do is you say, I won't claim it for me, I'll claim it for the whole group. Because that'll get rid of this, individual personalization. All that group is a bunch of individual personalizations, and what you're doing is playing one of them.
Just a different trap to fall into.
Exactly. So Nisargadatta Maharaj is very clear about this. Experience belongs to duality. Why? Because experience assumes an experiencer and something experienced. Even in spiritual language, we say, I had an experience of presence. Yeah. If you think about it, I used to always laugh because, presence is presence. So in the corporate world, guess what everybody's seeking out? And you hear this term a lot, executive presence. Because within executive presence lies this thing they call leadership. So if you have executive presence and you exude leadership, well, guess what? They pay you more money. Should have sat in a room and had them just send me checks. All right, so this is why Maharaj introduced the term apperception, right? To remove the observer, the owner, the experiencer. But the mind quickly converts this into a concept and holds it. I need to be apperceptive. Can't happen. How do I know when I'm being apperceptive, etc.? Right? Apperception doesn't, there's no eyes in apperception. He says, why does personalization reappear at every stage, even after a deep insight, even after a clear seeing? Look at childhood. This is an interesting thing. A child lives almost entirely in immediacy When a story is heard, it is not observed, it is entered. The dragon is real. The fairy is real. The experience is immersive. There's no distance, no observer, no interpretation. Then something happens. Immediacy is captured by intellect. What was lived becomes known. What is immersive becomes conceptual. And with that shift comes a new capacity to hold something without being it. Right? So notice that right, that our beginning our childhood, we are, you know, bathed in presence, and then we learn how to replace that, as it were, with a concept, right? And with this shift comes a new capacity to hold something without being it. This is the birth of abstraction, right? Children, as you know, young children don't abstract yet. It's this process when their intellectualization of children, abstraction appears, right? And within abstraction lies the perfect hiding place for personalization. It's a device that lives on its so-called emptiness, but simply paints over the vibrancy of presence once abstraction is applied. The ego no longer needs to assert itself directly, it can remain embedded, unseen in the structure of thought, in language and understanding. It becomes the one who knows, the one who understands, the one who is realized, not as a claim, but as an assumption. Right? There's a teaching often given, one of my favorites. The ego is like a tiger cornered in a room. At first, it is visible, obvious, dangerous. You know exactly where it is. But the moment you relax, the moment you assume it's been handled, it disappears and it reappears elsewhere unseen. There's a very famous story of the disciple that complains of the ego to the master, and the master tells him, the ego is like a tiger, and once identified, it has now been placed in the corner of your room, but you're not done. Never, and I mean never, take your eye off that tiger, for after all, he is a tiger. So that's the slipperiness. Say, not personalization is that tiger, not in the gross sense of I am this body. It is easy to see, but the subtle sense I understand, I am aware, I am beyond. That's the tiger moving in the dark. So when you say, I understand immediacy, Maharaj replies, whatever you understand is not the truth. Throw it away. Not refine it, not deepen it. Throw it away, because understanding itself is the last refuge of personalization. So the first thing we do is, in the process, is we take the egoic living of separation, right? And we know it's a story. And what we do is we try to develop a living understanding. So what we do is we move from that story to a story that does not include or embrace the individual pieces, right? We speak in that particular way. But in an understanding, you never completely leave the individual or the personalization behind. So ultimately, you need to get rid of that. So another place that this has a habit of stopping is when somebody gets embedded in all of the pointers and they feel like now the activity is just to repeat the pointers, repeat the pointers. No, the activity is now the movement, as Brad would say, into silence,
It
right?
sounds like, that what we do along the way, even after we've had experiences, is we keep coming up with more refined and expansive stories, but they're still stories.
Correct.
And as these stories expand and seem to incorporate more and more of what's going on, and maybe less and less of egoic perception, the stories are still there, man. And it's so easy to get caught up in that because I just
Well,
like I'm what I'm doing right now for crying out loud, you
well,
know?
we've lived our whole life there, right? So
Yeah.
So the frustrating thing about it is that from a teaching standpoint, the first thing you do is you teach story in, the wonder of story, the immediacy in story, the child having pure immediacy and all of that, right? You teach it in, and that's a huge step,
Yeah.
right? And then comes the back end, which is now we need to catapult the story, right? The story
All of them.
needs, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so So seeing that is incredibly helpful
Oh man.
so that one doesn't fall in love with story and say there's where the answer is. The danger of what we're involved in is to fall in love with a piece along the path, right? And not and forget that there's a path, right? The path includes the reframing of the story so that it becomes a living understanding, right? And that living understanding is helpful because what happens is it's in our thought. Our thought process is now moving with a living understanding of the transcendence of ego, right? It's in that living understanding. But then, right? It's like Osho used to say, somebody would ask a question, get to the end, and he'd say, keep going, keep going, right? So so this is
Until the whole premise is exhausted, right?
he said the final subtlety, even immediacy can be a personalized. I am in presence. I am abiding as awareness. I am resting in the self. Each of these statements contains a subject and ownership of position. Each restores a center. The unbounded has been bounded again. What happens when even this is seen? Not conceptually, but directly, the collapse of ownership. Immediacy remains, but no one owns it. No one abides in it. No one holds it. No one recognizes it because recognition itself implies a knower. In the earlier teaching, abide in the I am. In the later expression, even the I am is seen as arising, temporary, unowned, a movement, not a foundation. Now you notice I said there were two places to witness from. Remember, you said there's in that piece that we did from Maharaj, two kinds of witnessing. And that's the movement that this is. In the earlier teaching, abide in the I am. In the later expression, even the I am is seen as a rising, temporary, unowned of movement, not a foundation. You see, even here, Maharaj's final cut, he does not allow a conclusion. He says, there is nothing to understand. Understanding is only acrobatics of the mind. So even this entire movement cannot be understood. Not something, not nothing, not presence, not absence, not awareness, not unconsciousness. All these are concepts attempting to stabilize what cannot be stabilized, right? So think about this for a minute. What's the purpose of the ego? To stabilize the world as an arising, right? The world is an arising. There's a sense it needs to be stabilized. That sense is the sense of consciousness, but it gets extended into the particulars.
Well, it's almost like if you name something, therefore it has greater stability, we want to avoid the naming of these things, which
Yep.
is linked to stories.
Yep. So
Wow.
even in the end, the understanding, right? That's what happens. And yet functioning continues, talking happens, listening happens, teaching happens, but without a teacher, listener, or a teaching, right? The end of the problem. Personalization is the root of the problem, but only if it is believed, taken delivery of, unknowingly embraced. Seen clearly, it is just another movement, another appearance, another ripple, like the construction materials, right? So personalization has that aspect. So in the second version of witnessing, the one steps into, it's absolute awareness simply, right? Witnessing the arising. Right. So those materials are never taken in that particular situation, never taken delivery of. In the first situation, there's still the personalized I am, which puts itself in the position of witnessing, right? And now the witnessing moves itself to the absolute awareness. And finally, even this teaching is too much. Even personalization is a concept. Even immediacy is a pointer. Even entire structure must be left behind. You could say there is no one personalizing. There is no immediacy to return to. There is no path. There is no error. And even that is too much. So what remains? Nothing to hold, nothing to reject, nothing to understand. And as Brad would say, or I would say, silence. Right. So now remember, don't get too um, caught up in silence itself, because often within the spiritual world, silence has a sense of presence, right? So, so when he talked about how things will change, silence has a sense of presence, and that sense of presence even drops off. In absolute awareness, there's no sense of presence, right? So don't get caught up with how many times have you left satsang and people will look at each other and they say, I could feel the silence in the room today. Okay, just be aware. Be aware of now. Where's the movement in that? That's the outward movement. There's a claiming. I could feel the silence in the room today. There's a claiming that's happening there. Just see it. That's all. Back to silence. Right. Every time what you add to silence results in a claiming back to silence.
It's just editorial comments on
Yeah,
silence.
exactly. Exactly. So when you say, that Alan character is a hoot, right, in a certain way, right, it's like back to silence, right, back to silence. That's where it ends up. All right. Anything else you got? Did you any other add-on, Brad? You have
Well,
there?
this is just a comical thing because sometimes you say things like the first time I heard entification, this is goofy, but I'm just going to pass it very quickly. I thought of Entenmann's bakeries and and everything's being made into these cheese danishes and all these things that Entenmann's used to make.
Well, that's not a bad one because I always talk about extrusion and cookies. So, I'm always kind of like, hey, the Gion cookie cutter, extrudes certain kind of cookies, and the
Yeah.
Allen cookie cutters. Well, let's pop another. Like if you want your sugar cookies or you want your, ginger cookie, it depends on which extrusion, So I think I mean I like that as a metaphor. It's a fun one.
It's goofy. And the other thing was that it just seems like, silence can sometimes just appear randomly. You can be doing nothing in particular and that there's silence and my mind is not, thinking this thought, but you notice that there's no thoughts going on, you know, and it's just notice and that's it. There's no commentary. There's no I'm having this experience. It's just noticing.
So that magnetic propulsion is happening in both directions, right? A free sample
Yeah.
is just when the magnetic propulsion has pulled inward
Ah,
to such a degree that what arises is a free sample.
and it's for me, it's a wave of joy.
Yeah. I mean, remember last time we talked about how there was an affection. In other words, it's pure love. Love for what? No love, no love for it, pure love. So it's that sense, pure joy, right? It's just when the world is when the experiencing is completely whole, all of those pieces exude themselves, right? It's that same magnetic propulsion that's happening. So
I
I
can't
don't know if you
thank you
can
enough for this,
see,
buddy.
I don't know if you can see that when you talk about it this way, what's really kind of cool is the one thing you can really say or see is don't be in the way of it, right? Do not be in the way of all of this. So so that becomes what's watching. Watching is don't be in the way of it.
Yeah,
That's what watching ends up being.
because watching is even, that in a way, a thought or an appearance that we would consider to be phenomenal, from the human vantage point. They're both appearances in consciousness. You know what I mean? The thought
Exactly.
and the thing, right? So
Exactly.
I was playing around with because of some research I do, I was creating visualizations of this in an AI. And if you think about it, one way to at least visualize it. Obviously, these are just concepts and pointers, but if you have like a brain that's seeing out, that's how most people conceive of their existence. But if you just put a circle and everything's inside of it, that's more how this is.
Yes. Yeah.
So what this has been doing is referring back to that pointer constantly and just It's an appearance. The thought's an appearance. The thing I'm seeing is, you know, and there's no me seeing it.
Well, and
So
you know, have I talked? I think I've told you about the Tibetan meditation. You know,
exactly that
yeah,
meditation.
it's
Yeah.
exactly that. That's
Yeah.
the kind of physical version of it all, right?
Yeah.
You know, when one shuts their eyes, right, and is in meditation, right, and Ramesh and Nisargadatta used to say, you know, the thing that humans don't do is they don't include themselves in the perception, right? So what that meditation is doing is it's physically moving the body mind, which is what we identify ourselves as, into the perception itself. So then when you open your eyes, that perceptive piece, which is now no longer located in the body, it's located, I would say behind the body, but please don't take that to the bank anywhere because once you put the linguistics with it, it screws it up. But the experience of that meditation.
Yeah.
So if you ever want to do that here, you know, I think I've told you, but here's how you do it. You know, you look out there and you perceive everything that is there, right? And then you shut your eyes, and in that moment you include yourself in that perception. So now the perception, right, is you and everything that's there, right? You put yourself in the perception, right? And then when you open your eyes back up, that remains. Yeah.
And you know, that's exactly what they would do to initiate the remote viewing process when the
Mhm.
I kind of studied those archives for my research, and that's like the exact sort of process that they would go through in order to do that. You know, you can go anywhere doing that, actually.
Well, it's funny because I mean, you can imagine in the ashram, at Osho's ashram, there were people that were doing the remote viewing. So it was really easy to come into contact. You could put those two pieces together because you had people that were, you know, that were playing with exactly that. Because that meditation was one of the meditations that was was one of the popular meditations in the when the Tibetans would come in, they would do that. Yeah.
I just wanted to make a comment on Gion's metaphor about putting the circle around it.
Yep.
And within that circle, everything's moving as one. And that's where everything is automatic, and there's countless movements that go into everything we do that is uncontrolled, but it's all contained within that circle as one movement. I just
Yep.
wanted to mention that.
100%.
And that
Man.
that backs into that piece earlier when Joseph and I were talking about the Big Bang and how once it's right, it's all in there, but it's happening, right? There's no personalization around the happening. Right? It's been exploded into action, and that action's happening. So that was why Ramesh would often say it's already in the can, because if you think about that concept at the end, beginning to end, it's in the can. Right? Already done. And that's a pointer that takes the sense of the personal out of it. That's what that comment or that pointer was intended to do. All right, man.
Feeling juicy right now, Alan.
Bet you can almost feel the silence.
Oh, yeah.
All right, everyone. It was lovely. Thank you. I really I enjoyed today. It was a lot.
Thank you.
It was a lot of
Thank you
fun.
so much,
All right.
Alan.
I'll see
Take
you
care,
guys.
everybody. Good
See you
night.
guys next Thursday. Have a beautiful, wonderful week.
Ideal, buddy.
Bye,
Thanks so
guys.
much.